Hello. Voter suppression today is on the march in states across our nation. The actions we take or do not take now will impact whether millions of Americans can cast their ballots freely and fairly this year and into the future. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle, and we're pleased to present live from the front lines how we fight back against voter suppression in the states right now with Andrea Miller, founder of the Center for Common Ground. The Workers' Circle is a Jewish social justice organization that has been defending our democracy and fighting for worker rights, immigrant rights, racial justice, and voting rights for more than 120 years. Voting rights is our top priority today, as our entire democracy depends on it. In addition to programs that educate us on critical social justice issues, we collectively engage teens, college students, and people of all ages in impactful collective activism, Jewish cultural experiences, and we create meaningful connections to our rich Yiddish traditions and heritage. We want to start tonight by acknowledging that New York City, where I'm zooming from, is the traditional land of the Lenape people within the Lenape-Hoking territory. We're going to drop a link that will now allow you to access a map so that you can see who once held the land where you live in now. Our nation has a long and violent history of displacing Indigenous people from their land, and the colonization of Indigenous nations went hand in complex ways with the enslavement of African people. Tonight, as we discuss the wave of state voter suppression laws in the United States, we want to recognize that Native Americans today are facing particular exclusions and barriers to voting that must be remedied, as do the many laws drafted to exclude Black Americans from voting. Let us be clear, ending voter suppression is at the heart of ending our nation's shameful history of colonialism and slavery. Tonight, we will address the rise of voter suppression and what we can do to combat it today and into the future. Part of our response is standing strong with a community of activists. And as such, we're thrilled to recognize and thank the 16 co-sponsors for tonight's program. Please take a look at the co-sponsor list that has also just been dropped into the chat. We are really proud to be standing in solidarity with so many strong communities of activists. Whether you're here live on Zoom or watching this as a recording, thank you for joining us, and we are so glad to be working alongside you to advance voting rights. The first half of our program tonight is a conversation between Andrea Miller and the Workers' Circle Director of Social Justice, Noel D'Amico. Then we want to turn to your questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout the program, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Thank you again for joining us. And now I'll turn the program over to Noel, who will introduce Andrea Miller.
Good evening, and thank you, Anne. We're so pleased to welcome back Andrea Miller from the Center for Common Ground. Andrea is founding board member of the Center for Common Ground, the executive director of People Demanding Action, founding president of the National Women's Political Caucus of Virginia, and a member of the Democracy and Governance Working Group of the Virginia Green New Deal. Andrea is an IT and political director, a digital and election strategist. She designs and administers digital phone banks and texting programs. From 2013 to 2015, Andrea led the Progressive Roundtable on Capitol Hill, bringing together members of Congress, activists, and nonprofit leaders. Her expertise in voting rights, climate, and the Equal Rights Amendment is unparalleled. She has successfully advocated for legislation on both the federal and the state level. And in 2008, she was the Democratic nominee for the Virginia 4th Congressional District. Welcome, Andrea. We're so glad you're here with us.
And good evening, Noel. I am just thrilled to get to spend an evening with you and the Worker Circle.
Thank you so much. I want to just quickly say to our audience that we're actually going to have the chat closed for the first part of our conversation, but I will signal when that chat opens, and we hope you'll fill it with your questions, and we're definitely going to get to those soon. But to get us started, Andrea, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in voting rights advancement work and why the Center for Common Ground was founded.
Well, those are really great questions. Most people aren't born into politics, but I was. I had two uncles who were aldermen in the Daily Machine. So I grew up watching my uncles turn out the Black vote. Fast forward to 2008, I become a candidate and remember a lot of those things that I saw my uncle do. And I did those in my campaign, and then jump forward 8 more years when the NAACP hired me to be civic engagement coordinator for Virginia. And they hired 21 other coordinators, and Virginia was the only state that won. And again, I went back to all those things I had watched my uncles do when literally from the ages of 3 to 6. I knew that when you were dealing with Black voters, and voters of low income, you needed to make sure that they knew when the voting was, where the voting was, and that they had a way to get there. I noticed in Virginia that there really wasn't anybody doing that. And so when I set up those phone banks in Virginia, um, we were also running a free rides to the polls program. I brought that along with me. And after we did Virginia in 2016, Virginia has an election every year. We love them so much. We did another election in 2017. Now, if anybody is watching and you are from what they call a red state, in 2017, Virginia was 15 seats down in the Virginia House. And in that, 14 seats, and came within one vote of tying for control of the Virginia House using those basic techniques that I had learned as a child. Now let's go to December, a special election in Alabama, and we won that election as well. Why did we win? Because we contacted voters in the Alabama Black Belt that nobody seemed to know about or care about. We made close to 40,000 phone calls, and we asked the voters, had anybody talked to them about this special election? And we finally stopped asking the question when 100% of the voters said, nope. We were the only call or contact they had gotten.
Wow. 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 And I mean, you've continued that through the Center for Common Ground today, these very basic but critical steps to reach to voters of color in historically vote suppressed states, techniques that you learned as a child, that you saw in action, and that you know work. Tell us about the founding of the Center for Common Ground and some of its impact so far.
Well, I mentioned that I got back into get out the vote work in 2016, and then we did the Alabama election. We did the Connor Lamb election in Pennsylvania. And at that point, we realized not only do we like doing GeoTV work, we're actually rather good at it. So, strangely enough, when we originally started working, we were working under People Demanding Action, which is our C4. In 2018, we founded Center for Common Ground, which is a 501c3. Both organizations were nonpartisan, but as the C3, we can't coordinate with candidates. We don't work with candidates or political parties. It's just purely we provide services for voters.
Well, Andrea, the Workers' Circle and a number of our co-sponsors have been so proud to partner with the Center for Common Ground because no matter where you live in the country, you can take action to help vote suppressed people in vote suppressed areas have the information they need to have the best chance at surmounting the barriers that have been placed in their way. Andrea, let's turn and think about voter suppression today. When we think about the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we cannot help but think of the enormous courage and great sacrifice that it took to win this particular piece of legislation. It was a monumental achievement of the civil rights movement, and it required states with long histories of discriminatory voting law and also low turnout of Black voters to have any of the proposed changes to their voting law procedures federally approved before they went into practice. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was reauthorized many times and expanded and included language access provisions that enabled voters with disabilities to get to the polls. It prevented thousands of discriminatory state laws from being passed. What happened?
Well, number one, they didn't go all the way to the Constitution. Remember, Black voters or Black men got the, and I'm going to say, ability to vote with the 19th Amendment. Women didn't get the ability to vote until literally 1954. So, 1920. So we're literally looking at, it wasn't until the 20th century that women, regardless of their race, we finally achieved more than property status, and we achieved, quote, citizen and human status. Well, when you have a Constitution where the original form very plainly states, we recognize white men who are property owning as having the right to vote. And, oh, all right, I guess we'll let the other people in. We need to go back and change the Constitution and be very, very specific about who can vote. So I like Representative Mark Pocan's language for a constitutional amendment. Every citizen of the United States of voting age shall have the fundamental right to vote in any election held in the jurisdiction in which we reside. So remember, even with the Voting Rights Act, we still had not gotten rid of felony disenfranchisement, which still impacts more than 5.4 million people in the United States.
It's true. It didn't go as far as the Constitution. And yet it did expand the vote so that people who had been unable to access that ballot finally were able to access it. And then came the horrible Shelby v. Holder decision of 2013, where the Supreme Court decided to cut the heart out of the Voting Rights Act and change so that effectively ending pre-clearance. And Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said it was like throwing out your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And once those floodgates open, I think Texas was the first out of the door with their voter ID law, and it began building up speed year after year, faster and faster, till then in 2021, 19 states passed 34 laws to restrict voting. And those laws are in operation right now. They have been implemented. They are in play during the primaries that are being held. They will be in play during November. But when voter suppression comes to mind, if you just interviewed a person on the street, I think the first thing we tend to think of are the Jim Crow laws, where Black Americans, whom the Constitution ostensibly had been granted the right to vote, were actively disenfranchised by all kinds of tests that were applied just to them, literacy tests. They had to have a qualified white person attest to their moral character. There were things like impossible questions. How many kernels of corn are in this jar? And then, of course, if you were you had registered, they publish your name in the newspaper. So many people who went and had the courage to, get through and claw all the way through, then their jobs were at risk, and their lives from the
lives.
So those are the things that come to mind, I think, when you think of an ordinary person on the street. What is voter suppression? But tell us what voter suppression looks like today, because there are some real differences. What are the differences, and who is being targeted?
Well, when we look at the old voter suppression, the old Jim Crow, I sometimes say Jim Crow has been replaced by his grandson, James L. Crow, Esquire. Mm-hmm. So it's very subtle adjustments to laws. So as you said, voter ID or photo ID even. And people go, well, everybody's got a driver's license. Who doesn't have a photo ID? Well, that would be many seniors who no longer drive. They don't have a driver's license. And Black seniors who were born in the South, especially the rural South, may not have ever had an official birth certificate because they lived in a little town of 400 or 500 people. Everybody knew them, and they never worked outside of their home or maybe for a neighbor. So why did they need a photo ID? So one of our partners, Vote Riders, one of the things they do is they actually help people who don't have ID acquire ID. I know I needed to get a new copy of my birth certificate in order to get a passport. And it was relatively difficult, and it cost $50. Well, there are many people who don't have the internet, don't know how to use computers, couldn't afford $50 to get a certified copy of their birth certificate. In some cases, no birth certificate was ever issued. Now, you're going to love this fact. In Virginia, African Americans could not be born in a hospital until the late 60s. They had to be born at home. Now, if you were born in a hospital, hospitals normally, as part of their routine, automatically produce and issue a birth certificate.
Mm-hmm. You've really gone into some detail, helping us understand why something that ostensibly seems fair, or why wouldn't people have this, actually serves to disenfranchise people. I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that it's Pride Month. There are transgender voters whose
Yes.
ID does not match who they are. There may be a difference in documentation. And that's another group of people that particular law would disenfranchise effectively, especially if those polls don't have same day registration that would enable people to vote.
And most states don't offer same day registration. I know I'm working on real ID. As a woman, I have a married name that is not the same as my maiden name. So that means in order to get a real ID, in addition to my birth certificate, which has my maiden name, I now have to go and get a copy of my marriage license. Well, I went online, filled out the forms, got my documents notarized, paid my money, and then the city of San Francisco came back and said, number one, if you're going to pay by check, it has to have a San Francisco address on it. Well, I don't live in San Francisco anymore. I haven't lived in San Francisco for 18 years. So there are many, in some cases, it's not really deliberate barriers, but it is a barrier to getting the necessary documentation that you need.
It was interesting. Ari Berman was on a program with us earlier this year, and he talked about how a lot of the administrative work then gets offloaded to people as they try to navigate these new requirements. And he described it as voter suppression by 1,000 paper cuts. And
Yes.
it's really effective. We're going to get into some more examples of voter suppression in just a minute, but I wanted to pause because earlier you said, look, the Voting Rights Act was phenomenal, but it never made it to the status of changing the Constitution, which is important. Many of us were fighting back against state voter suppression laws by advocating for the passage of federal legislation this past year in Congress called the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act that would have set national voting rights standards, combated partisan election subversion, guaranteed that congressional districts are drawn fairly, and gotten big money out of politics. But unfortunately, despite assiduous work by so many of the people that are on this call right now, that bill was not able to earn the 60 votes needed in the Senate to surmount the filibuster, and it failed in January as the Senate refused to set aside the filibuster and prize that racist rule that has long bedeviled our nation ahead of every American's right to vote. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, the Workers' Circle's been calling for the elimination of the filibuster since 1957 as a fundamental matter of racial justice. Would you agree that the filibuster itself needs to go in order to get the voting rights we need?
Yes, because the filibuster says on everything we are going to require a super majority. Well, that wasn't the idea with Congress. The idea was you needed to get a majority of the legislators to agree. So it's a simple majority in the House. One vote does it. But in the Senate, they had this very arcane rule that basically says, well, unless they agree to bypass the filibuster, like you said, you need 60 out of 100 votes.
It really enables minority rule because it disproportionately favors those states, because the Senate, you get 2 senators from every state.
So no matter how small
how
you
big
are,
or how
the
right.
House doesn't work that way.
Exactly, exactly. Now, you kindly explained a bit about voter ID and how that's impacting people's ability to cast their ballot. But let's start to get to how we address something like that. So how does like the Center for Common Ground, when you're reaching out to people, what do you do to help them know the kinds of IDs they need? Or how does that all work, Andrea?
Well, in our phone banks and our text banks, when we're telling voters, this is where you can go and vote, this is when you can go and vote, we normally tell them if they're in a photo ID state, don't forget your photo ID. And for a full list of acceptable ID, then we tell them where they can get that list. And we give them the phone number of their individual county registrar. So whenever we are doing get out the vote, we work on a county by county basis. Every county has a different phone number for the Board of Elections. Different states have different voter ID, photo ID requirements. Virginia is no longer a photo ID state. So that was one of the things, one of the very progressive voting laws we were able to pass in the 2021 legislature. So while 19 other states were passing laws to suppress the vote, we were passing laws to expand voting.
And so, of course, the passage of these laws all gets justified with the big lie that, President Trump didn't win the election, the incorrect information, the absolutely false information that there's widespread voter fraud out there. And I'm cognizant that right now with these public hearings going on, the American public is really beginning to get a taste for how the way we talk about our electoral system dramatically impacts our confidence in that system. And so those hearings are very important. Meanwhile, these voter suppression laws that have been so carefully crafted to seem neutral on their face, like voter ID, but really end up discriminating. I want to walk through some of them with you and give us a sense of what to do and how to surmount these things. Like, for example, in some places, there are extremely long lines at the polls. Now, those long lines don't just happen. Tell us about how those long lines get created and some of the laws against assisting people with food and water as they wait in those long lines.
Well, in Georgia, a lot of those long lines were caused by the voting machines that they were using in the polling locations, and the fact that A, they didn't have enough machines, B, people had not received proper training, and C, some of the machines were out of calibration and just didn't work properly. In Texas and in Philadelphia, during early voting, the machines were programmed for the wrong start date of the election.
Ay, ay, ay.
So when you were talking about a sophisticated piece of equipment, theoretically, one would hope you have well-trained, sophisticated people setting them up. That just really wasn't the case. And now New York, you failed to pass a law to ban the same kind of machines they used in Georgia. So expect, as those machines start coming into New York, you're going to see the same problems in New York.
Oh, geez, something to really look forward to and something we'll have to address in the next legislative session. I know there was a
Yes.
group working on it. Unfortunately, they didn't make headway there. But when we don't make headway on something that's important, we have to keep putting on our thinking cap to say, all right, here's this barrier. If we can't remove the barrier, how do we get people
How do
under
we go around it?
around it? You know, we've got to help voters get there and get the best chance. Now, look, with these long lines, sometimes there's been poll closures, especially in certain districts, predominantly.
And that is
Yeah.
illegal. If you are in line, you are supposed to be allowed to vote. So
Mhm.
there have been numerous instances where people just close the poll with people standing in line. That is illegal. But once they do it, all right, people didn't get the ability to vote. That is one of the reasons I love early voting, although early voting does have a little piece of suppression built into it. The suppression piece of early voting is early voting locations are generally only available if you have the internet. That's
Mm.
how you find out where they are. They're not on your voter registration card.
Oh
No.
my
And they
goodness. I
never
didn't
will
realize
be.
that at all.
They never will be because early voting locations change.
Okay.
There's one set during the general and a much smaller set during the primary.
Wow. So that makes it even more important to reach voters to make sure they know those locations of early voting. They know how to get there. They know when they're open. So between arbitrary poll closings that then leave people disenfranchised to planned, oh, we don't need that many polls in this area, that establish long lines, then we end up with these long lines. And the Georgia law, of course, SB 202, where you can't even give food or water to people waiting in line. How are we dealing? There's early voting, but are there other ways for dealing with that?
Well, again, trying to get as many people to vote before election day will really, 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 really help. Otherwise, voters will simply need to make sure that when you go and vote, you bring a bottle of water, you bring a little snack if you are prone to low sugar, and you make a friend in line if you don't bring one, so that if you need to take a bathroom break, you have someone holding your place in line. So again, when we know where the fix is in, we can begin to work around it, like vote by mail. In Texas, voters that were 65 and over were entitled to vote by mail. 65 and older, voters who were pregnant, voters who were going to be out of the county on election day. What did the governor do when they saw a lot of people starting to vote by mail? Um, they said, well, okay, hold up. We are going to limit how and when you can turn in your ballot. Now, you can mail your ballot in, that's just fine. They had these wonderful things called drop boxes. Well, Governor Abbott decided every county was entitled to one drop box. Harris County, which is where Houston is, has 1.8 million registered voters, and they had one drop box.
Mm. Well, let's talk a little bit about those mail-in ballots because we kind of need to know the good, the bad, and the ugly of them. For example, there have been some states who historically have allowed anybody to vote by mail that send out ballots to them and they return it. It's even
Washington State, California, Ohio, before they
right.
went crazy.
But there are also issues with vote by mail. And some forms are particularly tricky. The Texas form is notorious. Thousands of people's ballots were just disqualified. It's designed to trip people up and to ask for confusing types of identifying information or funny places to sign. Then we also know that some states will send those ballots out proactively, and in other states, you've got to ask for them and you might have to give a reason for them. And then finally, voters with disability have raised this over and over, that vote by mail is not a winning solution for voters with disabilities, because many may have difficulties completing those forms, and then it's further hampered by whether they can assign someone to return their form to the proper location. So can you give us a sense of where there are kind of good mail-in protocols for ballots and horrible ones, and how we can help wherever we are to address the shortcomings and make sure voters know what they need to do?
And vote by mail is very, 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 very complicated. Voting in person is just so much easier. You go there, you check in, they give you a ballot, you mark your ballot, and then you're done. When you're voting by mail, there are all these procedures to vote. Did you sign the affidavit? Is a witness signature required? Virginia now says everybody can vote by mail, but we have to have a witness signature. No witness, nope, that ballot is going to be rejected and you're going to have to go and cure it. North Carolina used to require 2 witnesses.
Oh my goodness.
That is very, very difficult for people who live alone, and people who live alone and they're rural.
Yes.
Then you can put your ballot in the mail. That's normally a possibility, and that gets tricky. Put the ballot in the security envelope, put the security envelope in the mailing envelope, and different states allow different people to deliver the ballot, either to a drop box. So, for instance, in North Carolina, they define the ability to deliver a ballot. There are no drop boxes in North Carolina, by the way, during early voting or to the registrar's office. They limit it to a close personal relative, and they list how people have to be related to you in order to drop off your ballot. So again, if you are a disabled person who doesn't happen to have a relative nearby, you are going to be restricted to mailing your ballot. One of the big problems we saw in Texas was it was taking 30 days or more to get a ballot after you requested it. Well, depending on when you finally got your ballot, you could receive your ballot too close to be able to mail it and reasonably expect it to get where it needed to be on time. So adding into this mix, we've got Mr. DeJoy deliberately slowing down the mail.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
2020, interesting, amazing election challenges.
I mean, look, for everyone who's gathered here, I just want to do a touch base and say, if your head is spinning by the just the permutations of how things can go wrong and how your vote can end up being disqualified or never counted or never make it there at all. Yes, it actually is that bad and is that complicated, which is why it is so imperative for us to establish national voting rights standards that every American can depend upon, that are clear, that have early voting, that you can't mess around with the deadlines, you can't make it harder, that are intelligible for us. And that's why, look, we're not just talking about, going under barriers and going over barriers. Of course, we're going to keep working as hard as we can for those national voting rights standards. However, in the meantime, taking action by joining one of our phone banks. The Workers' Circle, with the help of the Center for Common Ground, runs a phone bank every Wednesday night, and we're calling voters of color to equip them. And we use a wonderful script that helps make sure that the information we're sharing is working in partnership with groups on the ground, like Black Voters Matter or Mi Familia Vota. And that way we're giving reliable messages to the voters that can help them have the best possible chance of casting their votes. Look, Andrea, all of us, I think, have heard about voter purging, as well as in some states, the ability of ordinary citizens to challenge a neighbor's right to vote. And the purging operations and the challenging operations are often couched as, oh, it's election administration. We need to clean up those roles. Tell us a little bit about those new state laws that exacerbate voter purges, and can voters find out that they've been purged in advance?
Well, first of all, I'm going to give you the good news. Voters can find out if they have been purged by every quarter. Checking the status of their voter registration. Country can do that. So it's simply a matter.
Pardon, you cut out, your internet cut out right when you were saying, I think you said every voter should check their status quarterly to make sure they're registered, and then something.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I apologize.
Oh, check their registration is active.
Wonderful.
So if you have a parent or a grandparent and they don't have a computer, check for them. When you go and see them or get them on the phone, Grams, let's make sure your voter registration status is still active, because different states require different things. Some states, like North Carolina, anybody can check the status of anybody's voter registration. In Virginia, you need the last four of their social, but you can check, because when you are deregistered is what I call it, meaning you were registered and now your Board of Elections, either the state or the county, has decided that, nope, you're no longer going to be registered. Most southern states, people don't understand this. Most people believe when they register to vote, they're registered to vote until they move or they die. That is so not true. Mm-hmm. In southern states, when you register to vote, you have the ability to vote as long as you don't miss 2 federal elections in a row. All
so
right.
It's contingent.
It's contingent upon your voting, which is why I normally don't like to talk about voting rights, and I talk about the ability to vote. Okay. As with any ability, if you don't use it, you're potentially going to lose it. And that's the way voting works in most states. Now, it's better in Virginia, not nearly as good as California. It is really devastating in states like Georgia, where they don't have same-day registration, or Texas. So that if maybe you couldn't stand any of the candidates in one election, so you didn't vote, and you were sick the next election and you didn't make it. And then here comes election number 3. You go out to vote, and what do you mean I'm not registered? At that point, there is nothing that you can do, because only registered voters can participate in the franchise. Now, if they're nice, they might give you a provisional ballot to make you feel good. They're not going to count it.
Wow. Wow. Look, I'm going to ask that we open the chat now. I think everything that Andrea has been sharing with us, I'm sure, is stirring up a lot of questions from our audience. So while I ask Andrea this last question, I want to invite you to start populating that chat with your questions, and we're going to prioritize them and get through as many of them as we can. While people are doing that, though, Andrea, let's talk about some of the good news for a moment. Let's talk about that Virginia new law that got passed, the Voting Rights Act of Virginia, passed in 2021, which is really a beacon for our nation. And I also want to lift up that the Workers' Circle and a number of other groups have been active in working to get past the Voting Rights Act of New York. And there was a whole coalition of us. It was coordinated by the NAACP LDF. And now that bill is through the legislature and it's headed for the governor's desk. So if you got any New Yorkers out here, place a call to Governor Kathy Hochul and say, sign that bill, sign that bill. But tell us about Virginia's law in particular, and any other laws that you'd like to lift up as a best practice, as a beacon of light and hope in these dark times.
In 2021, Virginia looked at what was going on at the federal level and decided to be very proactive with voting, so that if we did not get a reauthorization of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, now known as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that Virginia would have her own version. So in our version of the bill, it very plainly said, if you attempt to discriminate on the basis of race, gender, spoken language, religious belief, the Attorney General will be all over you in a moment. They also looked at what was going on in Texas when they passed the law that said Virginia would have drop boxes. Virginia didn't have drop boxes before 2020. And in 2021, when we looked at Texas in our Virginia Voting Rights Act, in our Virginia Voters' Bill of Rights, we said, and there will be one drop box for every 50,000 voters. So we were very explicit. So if you are going to pass state legislation, look very hard at what they did in Texas and in Georgia and in Arizona, and be very specific about what your law does. That's how we got in trouble in Florida with Amendment 4, when they said, we are going to allow people who have felony convictions to vote. They omitted a very important phrase. without regard to payment of fines and fees.
Yes.
Since they left that out, the legislature immediately turned around and said, wait a minute, in order to get your ability to vote back, you're going to have to pay all your fines and fees. So Virginia, in our restoration of rights laws, were very explicit that it was upon release from prison, irrespective of payment of fines or fees.
Andrea, thank you so much we're going to take that to heart, learn from what has been done badly and make sure not to do that. Don't try to reinvent a wheel that's already not a square wheel that's not working. And in New York, of course, we're excited that when the governor signs that law, we're going to have pre-clearance back at the state level. So, and expanded language access. I'm going to go to some of these questions now. There's a number of great ones. Let's take this one from Art. Andrea, what is the highest priority for voting rights activism if we chose to do just one thing, or maybe just three things?
All right. Number one, we always in every election must get out the vote. This year, we are specializing and focusing on people who are in danger of getting kicked off the voting rolls for not voting. So that is really where our outreach is going. So that's one thing. Number two, if you live in a state where your legislature is still sane, I'm not naming any names. I'm just saying if they're sane, while they are sane, because apparently sanity among legislatures is something that can come and go, look at getting your state version of your John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed in your state. And if your state has not already re-enfranchised people with felony convictions, work on that as well. And then finally, be prepared next federal legislative cycle in the 118th Congress to make whomever gets elected understand if you expect to have your office for another term, you will do this.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm going to kick it over to our voting rights team over at the Workers Circle. They're taking additional questions. Let's go to another question. Noah, I think you have one for us from the audience.
I do. This question is from Dave. So Dave lives in a great voting rights state, Maryland, and he wants to know how he can help people in voter suppressed states. He says that before January, he contacted 800 people for the People Act, and what can he do now to help people in other states?
Well, Dave, I am so glad you asked that question. We are still in primary season, and this year we decided to work on primaries because we realized if we can get voters out who normally never vote in primaries, if we can get them to vote, we've got an 85 to 90% chance that they will come back and vote in November. It's kind of like now they've got a vested interest in the election. So we are postcarding Florida. If you like postcarding, reaching out to those voters going, hey, there's a primary, you might want to get out there and participate. We are also phone banking in Georgia because Georgia has a primary runoff. Georgia is one of those states where if no candidate gets 50% of the vote, Texas is the same way. They're going to go to a runoff. Or if you like to send text messages, we've got systems where you can text 500 voters an hour. We would love to have you text with us if you want to give yourself a break. Virginia has 45 days of early voting. So Virginia will begin voting in the general election in late September. So we will be postcarding, phone banking, and texting Virginia. Another possibility, Dave, might be, I'm not sure where you are in Maryland, but possibly come to Virginia and give people a ride to the polls. Because if people are willing to vote but can't get there, that's still not voting.
So I just want to highlight before we go to our next question that the Center for Common Ground's website has a plethora of resources. The Workers' Circle is holding phone banks. You can join postcarding, phone banks, texting banks. And following this session, you're going to get an email tomorrow that'll provide you a link so you can sign up. Do not fear. Hey, I'm going to do a follow-up to this question here. Hey, I think we have a question from Joan. Is that right, Stephanie?
Yes. So a question from Joan is, I did much phone banking in 2020 with Common Cause. I love giving information to voters, but few answered the phone. Please speak to this. Is this still considered to be an effective way of communicating despite the answer rate?
Yes, providing you leave messages. At Center for Common Ground, we leave messages. Why? Because the voters that we call, we have discovered leaving a message, speaking to the voter, it really does not have that different an impact on turnout. Remember, we're not selling candidates. We are giving voters information on where, when, and methods that they can cast their ballot.
Fantastic. Let's go to another question from the audience. Maya.
This question is from Wanda, and Wanda wants to know, could making Election Day a federal holiday help in some of the voter suppression states?
There's yes, it would help some folks, others it would not. When we make Election Day a federal holiday, that means that people will get the day off work and it will be paid. There are, however, some businesses, restaurants, and many other places where people who literally are low-wage hourly workers, they are not going to get the day off. So yes, it will help some folks, other folks, there will be no impact. But since elections are normally won and lost by 3% of the voter less, it could really be enough. Election Day is a holiday in Virginia. So we have 45 days of early voting and Election Day is a holiday.
We're going to go to one last question and then give you the last word as we close up our program. I can't believe how late it's become, but the information has been extremely valuable. Let's go to our next question.
This is a question from Valerie, who's a frequent phone banker with the Workers' Circle. Where do you think we should be putting our efforts? Ending the filibuster or getting the Voters' Right Act passed? Or should we work on both? Or should we work on something else?
Oh, that is a great question, Valerie. And I think what we are going to have to do is we are going to have to literally master our ability to multitask. Yes, there is federal legislation that we must pass. If we do not elect the right people in November, we probably aren't going to have the people to pass that legislation. Now, what I loved about the original Freedom to Vote Act is any mischief states would have gotten into with existing laws. It simply rolled it back and overturned it. And it said, Alabama, you are going to have 14 days of early voting. And then with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, it said, states, we're not even going to allow you to just introduce this mischief without running it by us first. So we really and truly do need both. We need to overturn the bad laws that exist, and we need to make sure that they can't create any more bad laws that see the light of day.
Andrea, I'm going to give you the last word in like 30 seconds or less. Go for it.
I love you all. We've got a very important election coming up. This election really and truly is going to go down in history as defining, did we really believe in democracy, and were we really willing to fight for it?
Well, those of us who have gathered here tonight, I think we can say with one voice that we do believe in democracy and we are prepared to fight for it. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being with you. I want to thank everyone who has taken time out of their busy lives to be present. I hope you'll go from this program that we will share a link to it that you can share with others so that more people know the importance of resisting voter suppression and how they can go about it. Remember, there are phone banking, text banking, and postcarding with the Center for Common Ground that this Wednesday, tomorrow night, we're phone banking at the Workers' Circle. You could just go to circle.org or Center for Common Ground to find out more information. And for those of you who are headed to Washington, D.C. on Saturday or nearby, I want you to invite you to join up with us. We're going to be at the Moral March on Washington with the Poor People's Campaign, demanding federal voting rights and an end to the filibuster and much more. All of you following the program will get a follow-up email with links and more information and take action opportunities. So thank you, Andrea. Thank you all. And I look forward to seeing you on the front lines. Good night, everyone.